on that. So
Okay.
alright, excited. Okay. So what's your name?
My name is Roberto Ariel Vargas.
And how old are you?
42 years old.
How many years, if any, have you lived in the mission or on 24?
So I've physically having a home on 24th. I've only lived a couple years on 24th and Potrero as a kid. But I've spent a lot of my life on 24th Street, regardless of the different places I've lived around the city.
And is there any ethnicity you consider yourself?
Yeah, I'm Chicano Nicaragüense.
What's the date and place of your birth?
I was born April 9th. I was born at the St. Luke's Hospital.
You grew up in the mission on 24th?
I grew up in the mission on 24th Street, and you know, my family grew up on 24th Street very much. We grew up in the mission generally, but very much on 24th Street. You know, I remember my father telling me stories about different times in his life that he spent on 24th Street. You know, as a teenager. My father grew up here also in the neighborhood. My older sisters grew up here on 24th Street. I grew up here on 24th Street. So, for example, I can tell you as a kid, you know, when I used to get haircuts up the block here, right, at the barber shop on 24th and South Van Ness, or like hanging out on 24th and Mission. As a small child, you know, 7, 8, 9 years old, watching the cruise nights, the lowriders cruising down Mission Street all night. Or as a high school student, hanging right on 24th and Mission every day after school with my friends, you know, or my sisters hanging out on 24th and Mission in high school with their friends. So it's 24th Street is very much home for me and for my family.
And you said your dad remembers growing up in the mission too?
Yeah, so my father came from Nicaragua in 1946 he was 5 years old, and he was going to what was then called Licant Elementary, is now called Leonard R. Flynn, a couple blocks from here. And his family lived in different alleys, you know, throughout the mission, south of Market. But he always spent time here on 24th, you know. I remember telling me stories about the Barts and the White Shoes, which was groups of teenagers, sort of primarily Mission District Latino youth, sort of having social conflicts, beefs with kids from the west side of town, you know. And a lot of that being based right here, once again, right on 24th Street. There was a social club, what some people might call the first Central American gang here in the mission, called Los Primos, and that was in the 50s, 1950s, and they were all young boxers, primarily Mission High School students, you know, or telling me stories about Horseman, his years here, Horseman Middle School is right on 24th. So yeah, you know, my pops has a life history here in the neighborhood, and I do too, and my sisters do too. So yeah, we have sort of different generation of history here, you know. My sisters being cholas here in the late 70s, early 80s, on 24th, hanging out with their friends. There was a group called they called some Little Park. Little Park was like a mission between 25th and 26th, where it's a child care center, really, but my sister and her friends all hung out there, or hung out right on 24th and Mission. And most of my childhood was spent right out here, and then my teenage years hanging out here too with my friends, and in some ways claiming 24th Street as our own, and then ultimately, by way of that connection, eventually taking on work that allowed me to serve my community here in the neighborhood, in many ways on 24th Street, but working with young people on the streets here in the neighborhood, trying to get young people reconnected with school, or reconnected with work, or reconnected with positive ways to contribute to the community. So yeah, in that way, my whole life trajectory has been connected in many ways with 24th Street. And I can talk to you more about later about the work that I do now and how it's connected with 24th Street.
So how would you think that your dad would describe the mission, like from back in his day?
So I guess describing the mission back in his day is this sense of family and camaraderie amongst young people, particularly amongst young Latinos, primarily from El Salvador and Nicaragua, Central American Latinos, some Mexicanos also, but a lot of Central American, handful of Puerto Ricans. Riding around in their lowriders too. In those days, it was, they called it a car being raped, right? So they would throw sandbags in the trunk to drop the car down, right? They didn't have hydraulics. But for them it was the idea of being social. And it was getting together as teenagers to box together. They were all boxers, they were training at the gyms, they were competing. And my uncle Mike Gallo is kind of a neighborhood icon. Somebody you may see in the neighborhood. He's always got like a three-piece suit on, sometimes with his brim and his overcoat. He's one of the best dressed mission representatives, and he was for many years he sold men's clothes, and so he was always dressed sharp. And at that time, he was the leader of Los Primos. And one of the baddest boxers in the mission. He eventually went on to the Golden Gloves. He was the first Nicaraguan Golden Gloves fighter. So my pop, looking up to him as his uncle, was always running around with him and his friends. And so, given that guidance of my uncle Mike Gallo, it was like, you gotta look sharp, you gotta be ready to fight, and you gotta know how to dance, right? And so that was like sort of what guided their social scene at that time for them. But it was, definitely very Latino, very Central American, and certainly, a lot of Irish, Italian immigrants, probably older generations for them at that time. Those are what I remember of the stories of my pop sharing with me.
And then what was the scene like when you were younger?
So when I was a kid, like I mentioned, my sisters were teenagers and sort of the cholo scene for them as cholas, right? It was like folks were identifying with cholo culture, which was an evolution of the Pachuco culture that my pop and his cohort sort of identified with in the 50s and 60s. But for them, it was very much based around art. I remember them doing a lot of art. People would consider, I guess, cholo art and T-shirts. I remember the long T-shirts, like down to the knees, big T-shirts with murals on the T-shirts. Sort of claiming which group they identified with or where they hang out. There was, I think, a lot of less, even though folks identified with different streets or different groups, I feel like there was less violence and beef between groups in the Mission District. So folks identified Mission, there was not a lot of beef within the Mission. I guess sometimes folks would have conflicts with Daly City, or with Glen Park or Crockett Park, other areas. But within the mission, I think there was a lot more unity. When I was growing up, I feel we had some sense of that still. We had many different groups. And I was little Cholito myself as a kid. But still a sense, that we could go anywhere we wanted to in the mission and feel safe, right? Which I feel like changed very much, particularly in the 90s, in the early 90s. There was a lot more divisions between groups within the mission. A lot more gang rivalries and violence, I think. I know one thing that's interesting is growing up in the mission that is probably different than experience some folks might have, like in Fresno or Los Angeles and other places, is that we've always had a lot of diversity here. So we've always had black folks in the mission, we've always had Samoan folks, Filipinos. A lot more when I was growing up, I think, than there is now, as a matter of fact. We had that sort of that type of diversity, even with folks identifying with maybe a culture that from the outside might look like a Cholo culture. People wearing Ben Davis t-shirts, Converse. From the outside, people might identify that as Cholo culture, but Filipinos, Samoanos, handful of white kids, low-income white kids, black folks, working class folks, all had this sense of a shared style to a certain extent, a shared social scene, and we sort of took that for granted growing up here in San Francisco, and it's something that I think is much more rare anywhere, and certainly here. We're a lot less diverse as a city, and we're a lot less working class as a city. I think for the most part now, the working class that continues to exist is very much an immigrant population. And there's a different sense of identifying with community, I think, for the immigrant population. Whereas I feel born and raised here, I feel like this is home. Immigrant folks don't necessarily feel that way. They may feel as if they're in transit, and that they may end up somewhere else, or they may go back home. But yeah, I remember also in the 80s, when I was in high school growing up here, I think sort of preceding all the violence I talked about that really, I think, intensified in the early 90s was the introduction of crack. Crack cocaine sort of came into being here, at least very popular around 85, 86, maybe 86 more, to the point where a lot of people I was growing up with were selling crack, smoking crack. And that really impacted the community, I think, by way of suddenly having young people with a lot of cash, right? So young people buying cars, buying gold, buying fancy clothes, having pagers, and in that way sort of intensifying the competition for resources and intensifying pressure, social pressure.
Alright.
Good, brother. Thank you. Thank you. This is my friend Rafael. He owns this place.
Oh, okay, nice to meet you.
I'll meet you.
And so I think that the introduction of crack at the time actually had a significant impact on the community, dismantling families. Folks of, particularly of my sister's generation, late 40s, early 50s, getting caught up with addiction to crack, that generation really getting addicted to crack, and then folks of my generation, some of them getting addicted, but for the most part, getting addicted to the money and selling the crack, right? So I think that's a significant milestone in our community, is that introduction of crack and sort of breaking down the family as a result, so that folks of my sister's generations losing their children, ending up in jail, dying from overdose, and then folks of my generation going to prison because of dealing drugs, or beginning to use, and get addicted themselves. So those are some of the things that come to mind. I think like generational differences for us, for me as a family, and our experience here in 20 years.
And what about today? How do you think the mission is now compared to then?
Wow. So my dad, the last few times, he lives in Texas now, the last few times he's come to visit, the term he uses is the New Yorkification of the mission, right? Sort of how it has this sort of, hipster bohemian element to it. And we saw that change beginning with the dot-com boom and bust, where price of housing skyrocketed, people got displaced, long-time residents got displaced. But it's been, the changes have been so rapid just in the last handful of years with regards to the displacement of businesses, of families that have lived here for a long, long time, moving away to places that they could afford to live. And a lot more younger, more affluent people coming in, or younger kids that can, group up as roommates in a pad. And it's interesting. I wonder about the affluence of these young folks who we see as hipsters. I wonder about their level of affluence, and whether they're all in the tech industry or they're all coming from families that are affluent. Because otherwise it's difficult to understand how they can afford to be here, how they can afford to live here, eat here, play here. It's such an expensive city now, right? The change, I think, was really exemplified with the Valencia corridor. When I was a kid, those were all old appliance stores, right? So like that old appliance, so the appliance store you see right now on 18th of Valencia is one of the few that's still there. The majority of Valencia was all appliance stores. I think it began in the late 80s with sort of, I think the lesbian community moving in, lesbian artists in particular, sort of, rooming together, creating spaces for arts, etc. And then, later with clubs like the Elbow Room, for example, which when I was in high school was primarily a place where lesbians congregated, and then later becoming a place where there was reggae and hip hop and funk and many different things happening, and that change, I think, sort of ushered in other changes like trendy restaurants, which at the moment, from what I understand, there's been like 37 new restaurants opened and closed in the last several years, right? So those types of changes, I think, have really signaled this new mission where people are coming from all over the city to play, to enjoy the trendy restaurants, to enjoy the art galleries. And now we're seeing these art galleries and trendy boutiques on 24th, and that's just in the last 1 to 2 years. I mean, that's very recent, right? And I gotta admit, as a long-term resident, I'm much more comfortable because I have children. When I go out and play, I'm much more comfortable taking them on Valencia. The restaurants, the venues, the shops are much more interesting, right? Than a Mission, for example. They're like parallel worlds, Valencia and Mission. But to see it happening on 24th Street is much more disturbing to me because it signals further displacement of businesses, of homes, to a point where it's difficult for this restaurant we're in that my friend owns. It's difficult for long-term residents of the Mission to own and sustain themselves, either own businesses or own properties, right? The cost of property is just skyrocketed. The cost of maintaining a business is skyrocketed. Folks are getting offers, landlords are getting offers, 3, 4, 5 times the asking price of rent, in order to displace folks who are currently there, right? Folks who are coming and offering cold hard cash to discontinue leases or to not renew leases. So now you got, 3 new bars within a block from us right here, right? And now that I work in public health, there's also another concern I have, and folks I think in the public health community have, with regards to the amount of alcohol, the off-sale alcohol. Well, the bars is one thing, liquor stores is another. Right here at this corner, the intersection of 24th and Folsom, when I was in high school, at every corner of this intersection there was a liquor store, which was problematic, of course. One of them used to sell to us as teenagers all the time. We always bought alcohol there. The fact that you now have a juice shop and Phil's Coffee. Phil used to have one of those liquor stores, right? Now there's only one corner with the liquor store, right? So, in some regards, that's a good thing, right? Moving away from liquor stores. We need less liquor stores in this community, certainly. But to have more bars certainly contributes to the increased level of drinking in our community and this sort of sense of Mardi Gras. It's like a perpetual Mardi Gras where you got young white folks walking around with drinks in their hands. When I was a kid, we never walked around. I mean, maybe once in a while somebody walked around with an open container wrapped in a paper bag, right? But you're gonna get busted by the cops, inevitably. Now it's like you can walk around with open containers like it's Mardi Gras, right? And part of it is because now it's young white kids, right? And it's not older folks of color or kids of color, right? So I think that changes the dynamic with regards to law enforcement and how they deal with people. But unfortunately, I think a consequence of that is now you got more people drinking in the streets. Dolores Park, you got people sitting around drinking and smoking like it's a daily festival, right? If you're young, that's cool, that's fun, right? But if you're a parent, you might be concerned, shit, my kid's gonna be out there with everybody drinking and smoking in front of my kid, right? And if you're a long-term resident like I am, you might say, wow, it's interesting to see how the change in demographics changes the way law enforcement deals with folks too, right? And the racism that's inherent behind that is disturbing. So yeah, lots of changes. It's some of it's cool, some of it's exciting. Nice to be able to go to more, interesting bars and restaurants. If you're somebody like me who has extra money to spend now, and if you're somebody like me who's born and raised here, I feel like every time I see a new restaurant open on 24th or on Valencia, I feel like my nails are scratching along the sidewalk with this constant pull, and making my stay here in the city much more tenuous by the day, right? I'm renting from my godparents right now. If my god sister one day decides she wants to move back into that house, I don't know where I live in this city. I don't know if I can afford to stay in this city, right? And I'm a professional. I have a graduate degree. I have a pretty good job. My wife has a graduate degree. She's got a pretty good job. I don't know if we could afford to stay in this city. Unless we decided to cram into a tiny apartment with our 2 children, right? So while the opportunities presented with the nice restaurants and clubs are fun to a certain extent, they also represent a threat for our ability to stay in the city. So I know one question you have there with regards to gang issues in the community. I wanted to speak to that briefly. The way gangs have formed and have been viewed is an evolution in this community. Like I mentioned, my pop was a teenager, they were Los Primos, and they were seen as a social club. Those men viewed it as a gang, right? When I was a youngster, I got jumped into what would be called a gang, but it was mostly kids hanging out on this corner from this community. As a teenager, I was identified with a particular corner. I didn't call it a gang, but folks might have seen us as a gang, right? I got a job working in my community. The money that paid for me to work there initially was the gang prevention program. So it was money targeted to work with gangs. I worked with kids who identified themselves with gangs. And we worked trying to develop peace treaties between young folks that at that time were, this is the early 90s, we had as a city, 124, 130 killings per year. As a city currently, we're about, 95 maybe per year, homicides. So we had a higher level of death at that time and a higher level of gang-related violence at that time. Our work as a community organization at RAP, the Alternatives Program, was to get young people sort of developing their consciousness, their political consciousness about why things are the way they are. Why were their opportunities limited? Why was it when they got locked up in juvenile hall? 90% of the kids are African American and Latino. Why is it that their employment opportunities are so limited? Why is it that their parents are feeling pushed out of the community, priced out of the community? So we wanted to do some consciousness raising. We wanted to do community organizing, community building, offer them opportunities to give back to their communities, to their families. And so in that way, the gang issue is, I think, constantly evolving. If you look at the definition, identifying markers, folks committing crime for the benefit of the group. I mean, if you look at that, the police department is a gang, right? And it's one of the baddest gangs in the neighborhood, right? So it all depends on what lens you take on and how you look at things. And we understand that in our community, the police don't always play a positive role. They often commit crime. As a young person, actually myself, I got beat up. Since we're talking about 24th, I got beat up by the police at least 3 times on 24th Street alone. That doesn't include the several times they beat me up elsewhere, which helped shape my phobias of dealing with police. It helped shape my lack of trust for the police department. Fortunately, I've been able to work through some of that, and I understand that not all cops are bad, and that there are some opportunities for us to collaborate with police to do good things. But I think I always feel compelled to mention that when I say anything about gangs, because I don't want to be one-sided with how we view young people on the streets that are caught up, in unsafe activities. Any other questions?
What would you consider to be the most important events in the Mission District on 24th Street during your lifetime?
So, as a kid growing up, the 24th Street Fair was really important. It was a key event. It was like, people would talk about what outfit they were going to buy or wear for the 24th Street Fair, right? Or, man, I can't, you get a letter from family in jail, man, I hope I'm home before the 24th Street Fair, right? It was like a major forum, right, for people to have a good time. People, unfortunately, get into fights, hear music, local music. My father told me stories of when he put one of those flatbed trucks on 24th and Mission and had Santana play there when Santana was a kid, And so events, I think, that were culturally based. My parents were always involved in helping to contribute to the culture and community. They were two of a group of people that helped found the Mission Cultural Center. They were founders when I was a kid. It was founded when I was about 7 years old, and as a kid, I was in there with my sisters. We were sanding the floors, painting the walls. I mean, it was a community effort to get that place started. And you know, so the street fairs, the Carnaval, you know, is another one, another important cultural event. Here at the Galeria de la Raza, cultural events there, those were all key events on 24th Street, I know, for us. The parade, Carnaval parade coming up 24th Street, my family and I were we do Aztec dance, and so we've participated in that parade coming up 24th Street. My children participated in the parade with their elementary school, Buena Vista, many years, and so we chaperoned them coming with the parade, giving out water, taking pictures, or sometimes playing instruments with them coming up 24th Street in that parade for Carnaval. So those are some key events. Like I mentioned, some of the key moments in my life, like getting my ass beat by the police on 24th Street. Meeting my wife, you know, today my wife and I celebrate 15-year anniversary of being married. But 25 years ago, when we first got together, she worked right here on 24th and Folsom at the fruit stand. And I would come and I would buy one peach or one plum just so I could see her, you know. And that's another key experience in my life, is connecting with my wife right here on 24th Street. My early entry into the possibilities of alcoholism, buying up here at these at this corner store, P&S Liquors, they used to sell to all of us kids underage. 24th and Mission, when I was a kid, been involved in all the solidarity marches and events in support of the Nicaraguan Revolution, and countless rallies, candlelight vigils when the war was happening. My father went to fight in the war with a lot of folks from here, from the community, and we did a lot of work in solidarity for that movement, for that struggle, right on 24th and Mission, to the extent that at one point, you know, it was christened Sandino Plaza, right? Plaza Sandino. Those were key events in my life and in the life of, I think, many folks in the community, being involved in the international solidarity movement, something that raised the political consciousness of the community, something that connected the Central American community here with El Salvador and Nicaragua. Yeah, those are some of the key things that come to mind. Some of the outreach that I did with other people from our community to the young people on the streets here, pulling them off the streets, burying a lot of the children we worked with. You know, right here, once again, I don't have to go far. A lot of things happen within one block of us, right here on 24th and Folsom. DJ Domino, a youngster, got killed right there at the bus stop. You know, a youngster who was a city college student, beginning to develop his political consciousness. Someone shot and killed him there just a few years ago. Another kid I worked with lived 2 blocks up on Shotwell, Octavio Campo, stabbed in the neck at a party a handful of years back and killed. He was only 18. The last time I saw one of my students who was killed when he was 14, the last time I saw him was right out front of here, from this restaurant. He was killed because of gang affiliation. So a lot of key events just right here on 24th Street in my life and in the life of the community, I think.
What are some of the biggest issues you think are happening in the mission?
I think the biggest issue right now is is this the tenuous hold that I think we have on history. Like what you all are doing to preserve neighborhood history is really important, really key. So part of my job now at UCSF is to I do many things, but one of the things I do is to teach doctors and residents and medical students how they can play a role in community health as individual physicians in partnership with community. So one of the things I do is give them a tour, a mission right on 24th Street to talk about how do you assess the culture of a community, how do you understand what's happening in a community and understand the health of the community and how you can play a role in improving the health of the community. And you know, what I've been intending to do and still planning to do is to provide tours for folks that provide a cultural and historical perspective on the community, right? So I'm glad you all are doing it. It's great that you all are doing it. It's something that I've been meaning to do for a long time, and that's why I'm happy to contribute to this effort. But it's you know, it's something that I feel compelled to do because there's so many people here now that don't know the history of this neighborhood. When you don't know the history of the neighborhood, you don't respect Galería de la Raza and the role it's played in preserving art. When you don't know the history of this community, you don't understand the importance of patronizing Frutilandia as opposed to a brand new restaurant that opened across the street. If you don't understand the history of the community, then you don't honor those who are here still preserving the traditions and the history. And then it's easy to not fight for the right of Mission Neighborhood Centers to preserve the services that they provide here on 24th Street, right? You know, like they're looking to completely renovate that space and provide new housing and new services at the, you know, this portion of the block that Mission Neighborhood Centers owns. But if you don't understand the role Mission Neighborhood Centers has played in this community for over 100 years, one of the oldest nonprofits in San Francisco, then you might not stand in support of them, and instead you might say, no, you know, I think we need a different kind of a zoning plan here in the community, right? Or, you know, no, maybe we shouldn't support, you know, their bid to create the changes they want to create on their block. So I think it's really important to understand the history and to preserve it. And I think that hold on history is really tenuous at the moment, with the fact that Mark Zuckerberg owns a pad in the Mission right now, with the fact that all the techies from Twitter and Google want to live in the Mission right now. And so the more that this becomes a tourist destination, the more that this becomes a hotspot. This was listed as like the 4th hippest place in the nation by Forbes in September of last year, right? And with things like that happening, it becomes harder and harder for folks who were born and raised here to stay here. It becomes harder and harder for new immigrant populations to live here, unless they, you know, live 3 to 4 families to an apartment, right? So I think that is the thing that is the most threatening at the moment to this community. The diversity that makes this a beautiful place, a place of destination, is threatened by its own popularity, right? And that's the thing that worries me the most right now.
So, what changes would you want to see in the Mission, and how do you think we can reach them?
So, I think some of the, you know, planning needs to be intentional, right? If government doesn't step in to actively mediate business, to mediate development, to mediate affordable housing, then market forces dominate, right? And the problem with that is those with money rule, right? And so low-income families, period, are going to have a harder and harder time surviving here, living here. Forget owning here; it'd be great but even renting here is becoming more and more impossible. And so government needs to engage communities and think intentionally about how communities can plan for zoning in ways that families can stay. The supports are there that promote families staying, like social services, parks, food access, all the different things we need. You know, Mission Anti-Displacement Coalition and Poder took a key role in that. They pushed for a moratorium on any new loft building on 24th Street. This was like late 90s, I believe. In La Posta, which was a Mexican restaurant, was here since the 50s, got torn down. Market rate housing was built in its place. Mission Anti-Displacement Coalition, MAC, sort of made that the focal point for their efforts and said, we need a moratorium on 24th Street for any new loft development, and we want any new housing built to include affordable housing. Now, I'm not sure that MAC won that battle, but what they did win was a new stance from the planning department, so that the planning department engaged communities much more actively around zoning, around planning for development. And as a result, now planning goes out into communities and talks with people, has folks from the community come sit down and talk about what they want to see in the community. The Northeast Mission planning process was an example of that. But that was all a result of years of activism on the part of St. Peter's Housing, OED, MAC, others. And I think we need more of that. We need more intentional planning that includes community, incorporates opportunities for affordable housing, takes into consideration what families need to survive, and not just allowing the neighborhood to go to the highest bidder. Whoever can pay the most rent gets to bring in whatever business they want, regardless of the number of alcohol retail we now have on this corridor, or regardless of how difficult it is for long-term businesses to stay. So we need to not allow the dollar to rule the day with regards to how planning is done in our community. We need to engage community folks, have local policymakers think about what it takes to sustain diversity, preserve diversity, build new opportunities for families to move back into the community and stay in the community. I think those are some of the things that come to mind for me about what we need to sustain our community as a diverse place where families, Latinos, communities of color can remain in this community or come back to the community if they escape to Pittsburgh or Antioch or Fairfield, and places that have been more affordable in recent years for families.
And as someone who's been active in the community and its well-being, can you tell us a moment that you knew for sure you were helping to make a difference?
So like I said, as a kid, because my parents were activists and were involved in helping to create or sustain local community-based organizations, even as a kid, they expected me to make some contributions. So like I said, at the Mission Culture Center, for example, I had to help sand the floors. I had to help paint the walls. I was less than 10 years old. I think when I made a conscious commitment on my own to give back to my community was after running into my own problems with the law and getting into a violent incident where I was facing potential legal repercussions, and and having a community-based organization stand up to advocate for me and connect me to resources to help me out, I felt really indebted and felt like I had to give back. I had to pay back, that support that I was given. And so I went to work for that organization, which was RAP, Real Alternatives Program. And by way of that, I went to juvenile hall to help kids get out of juvenile hall, back into the community, connected with tutoring, employment opportunities, counseling. So I think I was 19 when that happened. 19 when I made a conscious decision. I wanted to give back to the community. I wanted to work for a community-based organization. But even at 15, my first summer job here was for Mission Avian Center. I was a tutor at Buena Vista Elementary School, where my children ultimately went to elementary school. So even at that point, I was a tutor, working for children, giving back to my community. But it was because I wanted a job. It was a job I thought I might like. It was easy to get connected to because it was in my community. I think where I made sort of a conscious, lifelong commitment began at 19. But as I said, all along my trajectory as a child, even because I was growing up in these organizations, I was always given opportunities to stay connected, give back, contribute. But I think after I, ran into a serious situation, life-altering situation, where a community organization was that change for me, is when I made a conscious decision I wanted to give back to community. And after that, I did that work for several years with the kids on the streets, but juvenile hall, in the schools. And then after working there for 3 years, I buried 9 kids that I worked with directly. In those 3 years, put them in the ground, cried at their funeral, gave my condolences to their mothers. At 21, I decided that was too heavy for me and I needed to step away. And I did. I continued working with kids, a lot of kids from the Mission and the Bayview, but I started working in the school district. So a little less immersed as when I was working in a community-based organization. And then ultimately later, when I got married, settled down, and had children, I decided I could go back into community-based work, community-based organizations, and then I became director at Real Alternatives Program. And did that for another 5 or 6 years. Had to bury more kids, unfortunately, but since then, or even then, I should say, continuing to give back in the community in ways that I thought I could. And then ultimately deciding I couldn't do that type of work anymore. I'm going to UCSF. I work at UCSF now. I do public health work. And my public health work is focused on improving health in low-income communities, so Mission District, Baby Norris Point, other places. Finding ways to leverage the resources of the university to support community-based organizations or community-based health clinics. So staying involved and trying to find ways to give back to my community. I'm on the board of Carecen, Central American Resource Center, and in that way I volunteer again with my time. I'm an Aztec dancer. We're always called on to do Aztec dance, funerals, community events. And that's another way we give of our energy, give of our time, back to the community. So in many different ways, I think myself as an individual, my wife, my children, my family, we're called on to give back to our community, and we find many different ways to do that.
And is there any last thing you want to say?
I think the last thing I want to say is I think this process that you all are going through is really important right now. In particular, this last year has felt like a key turning point in the mission, where sort of crossed the line between we're losing the community is becoming gentrified. I think we've just about crossed the line to where we've lost the community is gentrified, and so whatever efforts we can put in place to try to reclaim what's been lost or sustain what little is left, I think are really key right about now. And so glad you all are doing this. I hope good things come of this to preserve the diversity in our community, preserve the long-term businesses, families that have been here for a long time. And I hope to play a role in that beyond this interview. I hope to help play a role in preserving the history. There are a handful of books that I've collected with Mission District history in it that I can point you all to. I think more books need to be created. There's a lot of history that hasn't been documented. There are films that need to be made. There was that movie La Misión, which was a nice film set in the Mission. I think it was a very good flick because it dealt with issues that are important, but it wasn't necessarily the story of the Mission. Peter Pratt told that story, but Peter is not from the Mission. Peter is brilliant enough that he engaged community folks to be a part of it, making of it, to be in it. But there's still many stories that need to be told, and that's not anything against Peter Pratt, because he did a great job doing what he did. Other folks need to challenge. We need to challenge ourselves as homegrown Mission folks to tell those stories, to put them into film, to put them into books, into poems, into paintings, into murals. We need to tell the stories we know. We need to be a part of taking the lead around preserving the history and the culture, and not simply being reactive and being bitter about what we've lost or what we're losing. But we need to be actively engaged in preserving what we have, documenting what we've been through.
Oh, the boy. Sorry, I forgot exactly what it said. Remember, I think I wrote it down somewhere. Okay.
I think that's
So here's one thing. It says, what is the funniest thing you can remember one of your children said or did? My kids are great at saying funny things. My daughter in particular is, well, both of them, but there's one memory I have where we were at the new playground at Dolores Park. I can't remember who is named after. Someone wealthy, a wealthy donor that endowed money for the park to be rebuilt. And my daughter said, so who's that lady that is named after? I said, well, that's the lady that gave money to rebuild the park. She said, well, that's not cool. I said, why not? Just because she had money, they named the park after her. It should be named after a community activist or somebody who's given to the community. My daughter's 10, right? So I feel very blessed that on her less shallow days, she's got that consciousness. And I hope that, my children keep that consciousness with regards to the importance of giving back to community and the importance of honoring those who have contributed to our community. And one day, hopefully, we will actually get La Raza Park officially named La Raza Park. That was an effort, that was a community effort, community activists that are still around, still active, like Valerie Toulier, Roberto Hernandez, and others. They worked really hard to get that converted from an empty lot. They put in the physical labor, much like we did at Mission Cultural Center. They helped pull the trash out of that lot and turn it into a park. They marched down to City Hall to demand that the city invest resources into creating a park, and they christened it La Raza Park. And yet, the city calls it Potrero del Sol Park. That's the official name. That's what's on the map. That's what's on the sign at the park. And that is emblematic of what I talked about with regards to, a city forgetting or denying its history, right? Because when you deny the real name of that park, you deny the work that it took to create that park and to preserve that park, right? And if we forget our past, then we're going to be committing mistakes like that, right? And mistakes like not consulting with community when you decide to rebuild the park. Ultimately, they had to negotiate with community folks about what should be there, but that's only after the community folks got wind that they were going to rebuild the park, right? So, this is based on one of your questions. A funny thing my child said was, why did they name the New Dolores Playground after this lady who had lots of money, as opposed to someone who's contributed to the neighborhood? Hopefully the lady has done good things in her life, but if you have the type of wealth where you can give up money to build a park, you've probably inherited money by way of a legacy of racism or slavery or bootlegging, right? Hopefully not, but I'm glad that my children are moving forward with the type of consciousness about what it takes to be honored in our community, and what things in our community should be named after.
Yeah. All right.